Elderly man vanished in 1968. 57 years later, archaeologist uncovers name chiseled in two. The dust was a living thing. It coated his tongue, filmed over his eyes, and settled in the deepest creases of his lungs. A fine powder of forgotten lives and pulverized stone. For 3 weeks, Dr. Aris Thorne had breathed this air. The stale breath of a tomb sealed for 2 millennia. The necropolis sprawled across the sun-scorched southern slope of Amorganos, a forgotten Greek island that time had tried its best to erode. Here, under the relentless, indifferent gaze of a white-hot sun, Aris and his small, sweat-soaked team were trying to peel back the skin of history, one painstaking layer at a time. The work was brutal, a war of attrition fought with trowels and brushes against the stubborn silence of the ages, and they were losing. The local benefactor, the Lycurgus family, had made their displeasure known from the start. Their sprawling, whitewashed villa perched on the cliff above the dig site like a vulture, its windows dark eyes watching their every move. Elias Lycurgus, the patriarch, was a man carved from the island's own unforgiving rock. His face a mask of aristocratic disdain. He had spoken of ancestral sanctity and respect for the dead, his voice smooth as sea-worn glass, but with an edge that could cut. It was only the intervention of the Hellenic Ministry of Culture that had forced his hand, granting Aris's team this sliver of access, a 3-month window to unearth whatever secrets the Amorgano soil held before it was sealed again, perhaps forever. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that compounded the heat and the dust and the crushing disappointment of finding nothing but broken pottery and the scattered, anonymous bones of long-dead fishermen. Today was worse than most. The air, in the newly opened chamber designated Crypt Gamos, thick and suffocating, clinging to their skin like a damp shroud. It smelled of petrichor and something else, something cloying and faintly metallic, that turned the stomach. His team, 2 graduate students named Lena and Kostas, were working near the entrance. Their movements sluggish, their faces etched with a familiar end-of-day exhaustion. Aris, however, had been drawn to the far wall, a section the preliminary scans had dismissed as unadorned bedrock. He should have packed it in hours ago. The sun was dipping below the Aegean, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, and the generator, powering their lights, was sputtering its final gasping breaths. But something held him there, a nagging, illogical feeling that they had missed something vital. His fingers, raw and calloused, traced the cool, uneven surface of the wall. It was limestone, porous and rough. He ran the beam of his headlamp over it, the circle of light dancing across the stone, revealing nothing but the natural fissures and veins of the rock. He was about to turn away, to finally concede defeat, to the day when his light caught it. A mark, not a natural striation, but a line too straight, too deliberate. His heart gave a small, painful kick against his ribs. "Lena, bring me the small kit," he called out, his voice a dry rasp. "And a water spray." He didn't wait for her. He unhooked his own trowel from his belt, the edge worn to a silver sliver. With the focus of a surgeon, he began to scrape. The work was delicate, agonizingly slow. A layer of calcite and ancient grime, thick as a scab, covered the area. Flake by flake, he worked it away, his breath held tight in his chest. The unnatural line became 2, then 3, forming a sharp, angular shape. An A, then an R, letters. Not the elegant, flowing script of ancient Greek, but the hard, blocky capitals of the modern English alphabet, a cold dread, stark, and unwelcome in the humid crypt, began to seep into his bones. This was wrong, utterly, profanely wrong. This chamber had been sealed since the time of Augustus. There should be no English here. It was impossible. A hoax. A prank by one of the students. No, the calcite deposits were thick, ancient. These carvings were old. Decades at least. Lena arrived at his side, her shadow long and distorted on the wall. She handed him the spray bottle without a word, her eyes wide in the gloom, fixed on the patch of wall he was frantically clearing. He misted the stone, and the dust turned to a dark, running mud, revealing the marks with starker clarity. More letters emerged from the grime, scratched into the rock with what must have been a piece of flint, or a nail, or a shard of bone. It was a name. He scraped faster, his earlier precision giving way to a frantic urgency. The metallic smell in the air seemed to intensify, coiling in his nostrils. The generator outside gave a final wheezing cough and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Costas, the backup lantern. Lena's voice was sharp with alarm. For a few heartbeats, there was only the sound of their breathing, ragged and loud in the sudden, oppressive silence. Arisa's own breath was a gale in his ears. He fumbled for the tactical flashlight on his belt, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. He thumbed it on, and a brilliant white beam cut through the blackness, pinning the wall in its glare. Scrambled in with a battery-powered lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the shadows, revealing their pale, stunned faces. "What is it? What did you find?" Aris didn't answer. He couldn't. His gaze was locked on the wall, on the name that had materialized from the stone, like a ghost. The letters were crude, uneven, etched with a desperate, failing strength, but they were unmistakable. Arthur Penelgon. The name hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The trowel slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. The world seemed to tilt, the stone walls of the crypt swaying around him. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A different Arthur Penelgon. It had to be. But beside the name, there was a date. The numbers gouged deep into the rock. "Aris, are you okay?" Lena's hand was on his arm, her touch tentative. "What's wrong? Who is Arthur Penelgon?" He flinched away from her, stumbling back a step. His mind was a maelstrom of fractured images, of faded photographs and hushed, angry whispers from his childhood. Arthur Penelgon, the man with his eyes, his grandfather, the mythic figure of shame in his family's history. A British travel writer who had come to the Greek islands in the spring of '68 with his wife and young daughter Risa's mother. The story he had been told his entire life was simple and brutal. One day, Arthur Penelgon walked down to the port to buy a newspaper and never came back. He had abandoned them, run off with another woman, or succumbed to gambling debts, or simply vanished into a new life, leaving behind a shattered wife and a bewildered 5-year-old child. His grandmother had never recovered. She had withered under the twin burdens of heartbreak and shame, and had followed her husband to a different kind of oblivion years later. His mother, Alina, never spoke of him. His name was a wound in their family, a source of a deep, unspoken poison that had tainted 3 generations. He was the deserter, the coward, the ghost they tried to forget. And he was here. He had died here. In this suffocating blackness, scratching his own name into a tomb wall. "My grandfather," Aris whispered, the words tasting like ash. "That's my grandfather's name." Costas let out a low whistle. That's impossible, Aris. This place was sealed." Then someone sealed him in. Aris shot back, his voice raw with a sudden surging rage. He felt a wave of nausea, the dusty air thick and unbreathable. The cloying, metallic scent wasn't just a scent anymore. It was the smell of death, of a secret left to rot. He pictured his grandfather, a man he knew only from a single dog-eared photo, trapped in this space. He saw him clawing at the walls, his fingernails tearing, his hope dwindling with the last of his oxygen. He saw him take a sharp stone and begin to carve. Not a plea for help, it was too late for that, but a final testament. A message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of time. This wasn't an archaeological find, it was a gravesite, a crime scene. Pushed past Lena and Costas, his body moving on pure adrenaline, he ran his hands over the rest of the wall, his flashlight beam sweeping frantically. He had to know more. He had to understand. The official narrative of his life, the bedrock of his family's sorrow, had just fractured, and he was falling. Through the cracks, below his grandfather's name, there were other carvings, dozens of them, other names, other dates, all from around the same period. 1968, 1969, 1971. A litany of the lost. It was a ledger of the damned, scrawled on a crypt wall. What had happened here? A political purge. The years aligned with the Greek military junta. The regime of the colonels, a time of brutal repression, of disappearances and secret prisons. Was this one of them? An unofficial cemetery for the enemies of the state. His light fell on a section of the wall just below his grandfather's inscription. The stone was more heavily eroded here, the carvings fainter, almost lost. He leaned in close, his nose inches from the rock. The smell was stronger here, acrid and foul. He angled the flashlight, trying to catch the shallow etchings in relief. It looked like another word, scratched with a much weaker hand, the letters trembling and incomplete. A final, desperate addendum to his grandfather's message. He could make out an lay. His blood ran cold. He didn't need to see the rest. He knew the word. He felt it in the marrow of his bones. A truth so monstrous it defied belief. Lie. Kouris. The name of the family that owned this land. The name of the man who had watched their dig with such cold, possessive eyes. The name of the family that had fought so hard to keep this ground sealed, to keep its secrets buried. A floorboard creaked, except there were no floorboards. It was the sound of a heavy boot scraping on the stone floor at the entrance to the crypt. A sound that didn't belong to his team. It was slow, deliberate. The sound of someone who was not expecting to be heard. The sound of someone who felt they owned the very shadows that filled the space. Aris snapped his head up, his heart hammering against his sternum. He killed his flashlight, plunging his corner of the tomb back into darkness. Across the chamber, he saw Lena and Costas frozen. In the glow of the lantern, their faces masks of terror. Their eyes fixed on the entrance. A silhouette blotted out the last of the twilight filtering in from the outside. It was a large figure, broad-shouldered and imposing. It stood there for a long moment, a black cutout against the dying sky, listening to the sudden, terrified silence within. Then, with a soft click, a powerful flashlight beam pierced the darkness, sweeping across the chamber, catching the terrified students in its unforgiving glare before moving, inexorably, towards the far wall. Towards him, Aris didn't breathe. He flattened himself against the cold inscribed stone, the names of the dead pressing into his back like accusing fingers. The beam crept closer, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, silent witness. It slid over the broken pottery, the discarded tools, and then it hit the wall, inches from his face. He could feel the heat of it on his skin. He closed his eyes, every muscle in his body coiled tight, waiting for the light to find him. Waiting for the owner of the heavy boots and the silent tread to see the name he had just uncovered. The name of his grandfather and the name of his murderer. The beam stopped, fixing on the freshly cleaned section of the wall, on the stark, white letters of Arthur Penelon's final, desperate message. A low sound echoed in the chamber, a soft exhalation of breath. It wasn't a sound of surprise, it was a sound of annoyance. The sound of a man discovering a loose end he thought had been buried half a century ago. The light didn't move. It held steady on the names, a silent accusation in the suffocating dark. Aris knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the stone at his back, that he had not discovered a secret. He had stumbled into one, and its keepers were now standing at the door. The man in the doorway was Elias Lycouris. He didn't need to see his face to know. The aura of absolute predatory authority preceded him, filling the cramped space until Aris felt like the walls were closing in. The beam of his flashlight was as steady as a surgeon's scalpel, dissecting the scene, lingering on the names on the wall with an unnerving stillness. It was the gaze of a man reassessing a forgotten problem. Aris could hear Lena's sharp, panicked breaths, the soft shuffling sound of Costas backing away, deeper into the shadows. They were academics, not fighters. They were witnesses to something they were never meant to see, and the fear coming. Off them was a palpable animal scent. Elias Lycouris took a step into the crypt. Then, another. The crunch of his expensive leather boots on the gravelly floor was the only sound. He was flanked by two other men, younger, built like brick shit houses, their faces lost in the glare of their own flashlights. which they now pointed directly at Lena and Cosses, pinning them like cornered animals. Dr. Thorne, Lycoris's voice was even smoother in the confines of the tomb. The cultured baritone, a grotesque counterpoint to the horror etched into the walls. I thought our agreement was that your work would conclude at sundown. You are trespassing. Aris's own voice, when he found it, was a stranger to him, thin and brittle. We made a discovery. Lycoris's light finally moved from the wall and found Aris blinding him. So I see. There was no shock in his voice, no denial, only a profound, chilling wariness, the sigh of a man burdened by the carelessness of others. You have been busy. You have disturbed things that were meant to rest. These people didn't rest, Aris said, the words tearing from his throat. Fueled by a grief so sudden and violent, it was like a physical poison. They were murdered. My grandfather was murdered. He said the words, and the reality of them slammed into him. His grandfather, a man who wasn't a phantom of shame, but a victim. A man whose final moments were spent in this hole, choking on dust and darkness. A man who had a name, a life, a family that had been lied to for 57 years. The injustice of it was a white-hot fire in his chest. Lycoris was silent for a moment. The air crackled with unspoken violence. His two men shifted their weight, their posture screaming readiness. Your grandfather was a foolish man, Dr. Thorne. He was a writer. He asked too many questions. He dug where he shouldn't have, much like his grandson. The beam of light on Aris's face was an interrogation, a physical pressure. Some histories are not meant to be written. This island has its own stories, its own ways of keeping secrets. He failed to understand that. A fatal miscalculation. It was a confession. So blatant, so arrogant, delivered in the calm, rational tone of a business negotiation. This wasn't a man afraid of being discovered. This was a king in his own domain, swatting away a minor annoyance. The power imbalance was absolute. Here, in this tomb, on his land, Elias Lycoris was the law, and he was the judge, jury, and executioner. The Greek Ministry of Culture felt a million miles away. Their permits, their official sanctions, were nothing more than toilet paper in the face of this raw generational power. What did he find? Aris demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and rage. What secret was worth all this? He gestured wildly at the wall, at the litany of the dead. All these lives. Lycoris took another step closer. He was close enough now that Aris could smell his cologne, an expensive citrusy scent that was a sickening violation in the stale air of the crypt. Curiosity. The same disease that runs in your blood, it seems. He discovered that my family's prosperity was not entirely self-made. During the war, certain arrangements were made. Certain treasures were acquired from those who were relocated. Your grandfather, with his journalistic zeal, saw a story. I saw a threat to my family's legacy. To the stability of this island, which my family has protected for centuries. He spoke of it as if it were a matter of civic duty. The mass murder of inconvenient people as a form of pest control. You buried them alive, Aris whispered. The horror of it, a fresh wave of sickness. He looked at the walls, at the frantic scratches. He imagined the screaming, the fists pounding. On the stone, the slow, agonizing fade of oxygen. It was a different time, Lycoris said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. The junta was in power. Unfortunate things happened. Official records were lost. People vanished. It was a chaotic period. We simply tidied up. He paused, his flashlight beam dipping down to the name he had seen Aris uncover last. The name that linked it all together. A pity he knew how to write. And a pity you know how to read. The threat was no longer veiled. It was as naked and sharp as a shard of bone. What are you going to do? Lena's voice was a terrified squeak from across the room. One of the thugs took a menacing step towards her, and she fell silent. A sob catching in her throat. Elias Lycoris turned his head slightly, though his light remained fixed on Aris. That is the question, isn't it? This is a most unfortunate complication. We had an agreement. You would dig, you would find some broken pots, you would write your little paper, and you would leave. But you had to be clever. You had to look where you weren't wanted. He sighed, a sound of genuine regret. Now, a new chapter must be written. A less public one. A tragic accident. Perhaps a cavern. These old structures are so unstable. A terrible loss for the archaeological community, of course. But the island's sanctity would be preserved. The dead would be left to their rest, all of them. He was going to kill them, right here. He was going to seal them in, just as he had sealed in his grandfather. Aris would become just another name scratched on a wall, another secret for the island to keep. The historical irony was so grotesque, so profoundly evil, it almost made him want to laugh. He was going to die in his own grandfather's grave. His mind raced, scrambling for an escape, an option, anything, but there was nothing. They were trapped. The entrance was blocked. Lycoris's men were armed. He could see the bulge of a pistol. Under one of their jackets, fear was a physical thing now, a cold, heavy liquid pouring into his veins, paralyzing him. He was no hero, he was a scholar. His weapons were brushes and books, not fists and fury. He thought of his mother, Alina. He thought of the lifetime of lies she had lived, believing her father had abandoned her. The truth was so much worse, and now she would never know. She would simply have to bury her son, another man in her life. Lost to the silence of Greece. The cycle of grief would continue, unbroken. The injustice screamed in his soul. He locked eyes with the blinding light, trying to see the man behind it. "You won't get away with this," Eris said. The words are hollow cliché. A child's empty threat. Lycoris actually chuckled. A low, dry sound that held no humor. "Dr. Thorne. Look around you. I already have." He gestured to one of his men. The man nodded, pulling a thick, heavy-looking pistol from his waistband. The click of the safety being released was deafening in the silence of the tomb. Lena whimper, Ed. This was it. The end of the story. A story that began in 1968 and was about to be concluded in 2025. In the same dark, forgotten hole, Eris braced himself, a lifetime of regret and a sudden, all-consuming love for the mother he would never see again flashing through his mind. But as the man raised his gun, a new sound intruded. Faint at first, but growing rapidly louder. The unmistakable, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. Lycoris froze. His head snapped towards the entrance. The sound grew, a percussive beat that seemed to make the very stones of the crypt vibrate. A brilliant searchlight suddenly flooded the entrance, washing out the twilight, casting their elongated, monstrous shadows deep into the chamber. The sound was deafening now, a hurricane of noise and wind that whipped dust and leaves into the crypt. Someone else was coming. Someone with resources. Someone who knew. Lycoris stared at Aris, his mask of calm finally cracking, his eyes narrowing. With a look of pure, venomous hatred. He had been so close to tidying up, and now everything was spiraling out of his control. He snarled an order in Greek to his men, a word Aris didn't catch over the rotorwash. The man with the gun hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting from Aris to his boss, to the blinding light at the entrance. In that moment of hesitation, Aris acted. Fueled by a surge of desperate primal adrenaline, he lunged. Not at the gunman, but at the lantern sitting on the floor between Lena and Costas. He kicked it with all his might. It skidded across the stone floor and smashed against the far wall, plunging the entire crypt into absolute, disorienting blackness. Shouts erupted. A gunshot, deafening and close, tore through the dark. The bullet ricocheted off a wall with a high-pitched scream. Panic, chaos, in the dark. In the roar of the helicopter, in the echoing report of the gun, Eris scrambled on his hands and knees. Away from the wall, away from where they had last seen him. His only thought to use the confusion, to get to his team. To find a way out of the tomb that had become his birthright. The blackness was a solid thing, absolute and suffocating. The gunshot had been a flash of white-hot lightning, searing a momentary strobe-lit image onto Aris's retinas. Lena's face, a silent scream. Costas, cowering. The gunman arm extended, and Elias Lycurgus, a mask of pure fury. Now, there was only the roaring of the helicopter, the shouting in Greek, and the frantic scrabbling sounds of his own movement. He crawled blindly, his hands scraping over the uneven floor, the dust and grit embedding itself into his palms. He had no idea where he was going, only that he had to move away from the wall, away from the spot where Lycurgus's men expected him to be. Another shot rang out, wilder this time. The bullet wind passed his ear, so close he felt the pressure of its passage, and slammed into the stone behind him, showering him with chips of rock. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze him. He fought it down, forcing his limbs to move. He was an archaeologist. He knew this space. He had mapped it, measured it, lived in it for weeks. Lycurgus and his thugs only knew the entrance. It was his only advantage. He bumped into something soft, a person, a terrified gasp. Eris. It was Lena's voice, a ghost, in the dark. Stay down, crawl, he hissed, grabbing her arm. Costas to me. The searchlight from the helicopter outside pivoted, a brilliant white spear that lanced into the tomb, illuminating a swath of the floor. For a split second, Eris saw one of the thugs, his face contorted in a snarl, turning towards them, raising his weapon. Eris yanked Lena sideways, pulling her behind a low, crumbling sarcophagus just as the third shot exploded. The bullet hit the ancient stone lid, not 3 feet from his head, with a sickening thud, sending a spiderweb of cracks across its surface. "They're trying to kill us," Costas shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. He was huddled behind them, his body trembling. "I know," Eris yelled over the noise. "They think it's a cave-in. They can shoot us, and no one will know." The searchlights swept away again, plunging them back into disorienting darkness. Lycurgus was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the helicopter's roar. He was trying to regain control. Eris knew their window of chaos was closing. He had to think. What had the scans shown? Was there another way out? His mind, usually so clear and methodical, was a swamp of fear. He forced himself to focus, to picture the ground-penetrating radar images. There was nothing, just solid bedrock. The front entrance was the only entrance, which meant it was a trap, a kill box. He remembered the smell, the cloying metallic scent that had bothered him all day. It was stronger in the corner where he'd found the names. An air current. No, the chamber was sealed. It was something else. Something he'd logged in his notes but dismissed. A fissure. A narrow vertical fissure in the rock, concealed behind a layer of loose stones and debris. Too small for a person to fit through. Or was it? The back wall, he shouted to Lena and Costas. The one with the names. We have to get back there. It was insane. It was crawling back towards the gunmen. But it was their only chance. Lycurgus's men would expect them to cower in the corner or make a futile dash for the entrance. They wouldn't expect them to move deeper into the tomb. Follow the wall. Stay low, he commanded, pushing Lena ahead of him. He began to crawl, his body screaming in protest, every nerve ending alight with terror. The flashlight beams from the entrance sliced through the darkness like frantic, searching fingers. They swept over their heads, danced across the ceiling. Eris kept his face pressed to the floor, the cold stone, a small comfort. He could hear the heavy breathing of his students behind him, the scrape of their clothes on the rock. They were moving. They were trusting him. The weight of their lives settled on his shoulders, a burden heavier than any stone. He reached the back wall, his searching fingers finding the familiar rough texture. He felt along its surface, his heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm. Against his ribs, where was it? Had he imagined it? Had the fear finally broken his mind? And then his fingers slipped into a crack, a gap. Cool, fresh air raw, at least. Air that wasn't choked with the dust of ages brushed against his skin. It was real. "Here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Help me. We have to pull these stones away." They clawed at the loose rocks that had been piled in front of the fissure, their fingers bleeding, their nails tearing. The stones were heavy, awkward. Every scrape, every clatter, felt like a gunshot in the tense silence between the helicopter's passes. One of Lycoris's men was moving towards them, his flashlight beam sweeping low across the floor. They were out of time. With a final desperate heave, they pulled a large flat slab of limestone away from the wall. A dark, narrow opening was revealed. It was barely 1.5 feet wide, a vertical scar in the earth. The metallic smell billowed out, stronger than ever. It was the smell of damp earth, of rust, of decay. It was the smell of an escape route that no one had used for a very, very long time. Go. Aris shoved Lena towards the opening. Get in now. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed herself into the fissure, scraping her body against the rough-hewn rock. Costas followed right behind her, his earlier paralysis broken by the sheer immediate terror of the approaching footsteps. Aris turned to follow them. But as he did, the searchlight from the helicopter outside blazed through the entrance and caught him. He froze, half in half out of the fissure silhouetted against the dark opening. There, a voice roared. He saw the flash of the gun before he heard the sound. He threw himself sideways into the fissure, a searing white-hot pain exploding. In his left shoulder, he cried out, not from the pain, but from the sheer, brutal impact that slammed him against the rock wall of the narrow passage. He fell to his knees, his vision tunneling, the roar of the helicopter fading to a dull hum. The world was grey and swimming. He could feel warm blood pouring down his arm, soaking his shirt. He tried to stand, to crawl, to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He was stuck. He was going to die here, in this tight, earthy passage, inches from freedom. Hands grabbed him, pulling him. Costas. He was back, his face a pale blur of terror and determination. Aris, come on. You have to move. With a grunt of effort, Costas and Lena together dragged him deeper into the fissure, away from the opening, away from the light. Behind them, he heard Lycoris shouting, his voice filled with a frustrated, impotent fury. They were out of his reach, for now. The passage was tight, a claustrophobic's worst nightmare. It twisted and turned, scraping at their clothes and skin. Arisa's shoulder was a universe of pure agony. He gritted his teeth, the pain so intense it was making him dizzy. He focused on the small patch of Lena's back in front of him, on the sound of Costas panting as he helped to drag and push him along. They were his lifeline. After what felt like an eternity of scraping through the earth's guts, they saw it. A faint grey light ahead. It wasn't the harsh electric glare of a searchlight. It was the soft, gentle light of the moon. The fissure opened out into a small hidden cove, a sliver of sand and rock, concealed from the main beach by a high, jagged promontory. The sea was calm, its surface a sheet of shimmering silver. The helicopter was still audible, but it was further away now. Circling the cliffs above the necropolis, they collapsed onto the sand, their bodies trembling, their lungs burning. They were alive. They were out. Aris lay on his back, the cool sand, a welcome relief against his feverish skin. He stared up at the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky. He had survived, but the knowledge brought him no comfort. He was wounded, hunted, and stranded on an island controlled by the man who had murdered his grandfather and just tried to murder him. The discovery in the crypt hadn't just rewritten his family's past, it had shattered his future. He now carried a secret that men were willing to kill for, a truth buried for 57 years that had finally, violently, clawed its way into the light. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the night air, that Elias Lycoris would not stop until that truth, and everyone who knew it, was buried once and for all. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. His name was Arthur Penelagon, and he had been a man in love with forgotten places. He chased the ghosts of history, his pen and his camera, his only tools. In the spring of 1968, he was 23 years old. His face still holding the soft, unfinished lines of youth, his eyes alight with a fierce, scholarly curiosity. He was brilliant, charming, and hopelessly devoted to two people, his wife, Eleanor, and their 5-year-old daughter, Alina. They were his anchor, his true north. He brought them with him to the small, sun-drenched island of Amorganos, promising them a summer of myth and magic, while he worked on a travelogue about the lesser-known Cyclades. He saw the island as a living museum, a place untouched by the frantic pace of the modern world. He was wrong. He had stumbled into a mausoleum, not a museum, and the exhibits were far from ancient. Arthur was a man of details. He noticed things. He saw the incongruity of the Lycurgus family's immense wealth against the backdrop of the island's simple, fishing-based economy. He heard the hushed whispers in the tavernas, the stories of fishermen who had seen strange lights on the southern slope of the island, the talk of disappearances that coincided with the rise of the military junta in Athens. He was a writer. He was drawn to the silences in a narrative, the gaps in the story. And the silence surrounding the Lycurgus family was deafening. He began to dig, not with a trowel, but with questions. He spent his afternoons in the dusty municipal archives, his evenings talking to old men in the cafenians, buying them ouzo and listening to their guarded reminiscences. He learned of the war, of the Nazi occupation, and of the small but vibrant Jewish community that had lived on the island for centuries, a community that had vanished overnight in 1943. The official story was that they had been rounded up and sent to the camps, but the old men hinted at a different story, a story of betrayal, a story of a local family who had collaborated with the occupiers, helping them to identify and seize the assets of their neighbors in exchange for power and wealth. The name they whispered after the third glass of ouzo and a fearful glance over their shoulder was always the same. Lycurgus Arthur had his story. It was bigger and darker than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a travelogue anymore. It was an He found evidence that the Lycurgus family, under the leadership of Ilias's father, Stavros, had not just stolen the land and gold of their Jewish neighbors. They had murdered them, hiding their bodies in the ancient, forgotten necropolis on the land they had just acquired. They had laundered their blood money into legitimate businesses, building an empire on a foundation of genocide. And now, with the junta in power, their friends in Athens ensured that any lingering questions were silenced permanently. The southern slope wasn't just a burial ground for the ancient dead. It was a modern one, a convenient place to dispose of political dissidents, inquisitive journalists, and anyone else who threatened the Lycurgus family's carefully constructed reality. Arthur was a good man, but he was a naive one. He believed in the power of the truth. He believed that if he could just get the story out, justice would prevail. He compiled his notes, his photographs, his tape-recorded interviews. He wrote to his publisher in London, telling them he had stumbled upon the story of a lifetime. It was his last letter. Stavros Lycurgus could not allow the story to be told. He and his son, a young, ruthless Elias, cornered Arthur near the cliffs. They didn't ask for his research, they demanded it. Arthur refused. He tried to fight, to run, but he was one man against two, and they were fueled by a desperate, generational fear of exposure. They beat him, dragged him to the necropolis, and threw him into the blackness of Crypt Gamma, along with his camera and his notes. They sealed the entrance with heavy stones and mortar, leaving him to die in the dark, another ghost to haunt the island of Amorgonos. His final act wasn't one of despair, but of defiance. With a piece of his shattered camera lens, he began to scratch his story onto the walls, a final desperate dispatch from the abyss. His hidden witness was his own daughter, Elena Penelegon, who became Elena Thorne, Erisa's mother. She was only 5 years old, but the trauma of that summer had etched itself into the deepest recesses of her memory. She didn't remember the details, not consciously. Her mind, in a profound act of self-preservation, had buried them, but they were there, lurking in the shadows of her subconscious. She remembered the scent of oleanders mixed with fear. She remembered the shouting, the sound of her father's raised voice, something she had never heard before. She remembered the sight of his torn shirt and the dark, ugly bruise on his cheek when he came back to their small rented room on his final day. And she remembered the man who had been with him, a young man with cold, dark eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. He had knelt down to her level, his face too close, his smile a terrifying mockery of kindness. He had offered her a sweet alchemy, his fingers smelling of dirt and something else, something metallic. She had shrunk away from him, burying her face in her father's legs. She didn't know his name then, but she would have recognized his face 57 years later. The lines deeper, the hair gray, but the eyes, those cold, dead eyes, unchanged. It was Elias Lycurgus. For 57 years, Alina had lived with the ghost of that memory, a formless terror that manifested as chronic anxiety, as nightmares she couldn't recall upon waking. As a deep-seated, inexplicable distrust of powerful men, she accepted the story that her father had abandoned them because it was the only narrative she was given. It was a wound, but it was a knowable wound. The truth was a monster she had locked away in a cellar of her mind, too terrifying to confront. The discovery of the crypt was the key turning in that lock. The antagonist was Elias Lycurgus himself. He was not a simple villain. He was a product of his history, a man chained to the sins of his father. He had been a young man in 1968, eager to prove himself to the formidable Sparrows. He had participated in Arthur's murder, not just out of greed, but out of a twisted sense of filial duty. He was preserving the family legacy, protecting their name. Over the decades, he had buried the guilt under layers of wealth, power, and philanthropy. He became the island's benevolent patriarch, the protector of its traditions, the keeper of its flame. But the crypt was always there, a dark secret at the heart of his empire. He had nightmares about it, about the names on the wall, about the English writer who had almost brought it all crashing down. When Aris Thorne arrived on his island, a perfect echo of the grandfather he had helped to murder, it was like a ghost from his past had returned to haunt him. The same name, the same curious eyes, the same relentless digging. Elias watched him, his old fear mingling with a new, potent rage. He had built his life on a foundation of silence, and now this boy, this ghost's grandson, was hammering at that foundation with his trowels and his ground-penetrating radar. Elias had tried to stop him, to obstruct the dig through legal means. When that failed, he hoped, prayed, that the crypt would remain hidden, that Aris would find nothing but dust and pottery. But when his foreman called him, his voice shaking, to tell him that the archaeologists had broken through into Gamma, his carefully constructed world began to crumble. He went there that night, not just to silence a new threat, but to silence the echoes of the old one, to finally, once and for all, put the ghost of Arthur Penelagon to rest. The shooting was an escalation, a panicked reaction, but now that blood had been spilled, there was no turning back. He had crossed a line, and the only way forward was to erase everyone who knew he had crossed it. Aris, Lina, and Costas made their way along the rocky coastline under the cover of darkness, a desperate, limping trio. Aris's shoulder was a throbbing, searing agony. Lina had torn a strip from her shirt to make a crude sling and bandage, but it was already soaked through with blood. He was growing weaker, his steps unsteady, his head swimming with pain and blood loss. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the escape was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. They were exposed, wounded, on an island that was effectively a private kingdom. Every fisherman, every shopkeeper, every policeman owed their livelihood to Elias Lycurgus. There was no one to trust. "We have to get to the mainland," Costa whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to get to a hospital, to the police." "How?" Lina asked, her voice flat with despair. "The ferry doesn't run until morning. By then, his men will be everywhere. They'll be watching the port." She was right, they were trapped. Aris leaned against a rock, the rough surface biting into his back. He closed his eyes, fighting a wave of dizziness. He thought of the names. On the wall, they weren't just names anymore. They were people, victims, and he was the last link to their story. If he died here, on this beach, their truth would die with him. The weight of that responsibility was the only thing keeping him. On his feet, the tapes, Aris mumbled, his thoughts sluggish, syrupy. "My grandfather, Lycurgus, said he had tapes." "What tapes?" Lina knelt beside him, her face a pale oval in the moonlight. His interviews, the old men from the village, the proof. Aris's mind was latching onto a single, desperate, Hope Lycurgus had confessed that Arthur had compiled evidence. They threw him in the tomb with his camera and his notes. They wouldn't have cared about a few cassette tapes, they would have been buried with him. But Aris's team had removed several crates of artifacts from the crypt in the days before the discovery. They were logged, tagged, and stored in their workroom at the small inn where they were staying. Did we log any tapes? Aris asked, his voice a faint whisper. Costas's eyes widened. I don't know. Maybe. There were some metal boxes, heavily corroded. We thought they were just old storage tins. We didn't open them. We just crated them up with the rest of the personal effects. The tapes, they might exist. They might be sitting in a dusty crate less than 2 miles away. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was the only one they had. It was the evidence that could corroborate the story on the walls, the story that Lycurgus had so arrogantly confessed. It was the weapon they needed to fight back. I have to go back, Aris said, pushing himself off the rock. A fresh wave of agony from his shoulder, making him gasp. You can't, Lena insisted. Aris, you've been shot. You need a doctor, not a hero mission. If we don't get those tapes, we have nothing, Aris countered, his voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. Just a crazy story from 3 terrified academics. Lycurgus will say, we're lying. He'll say, we desecrated the tomb. He'll paint us as villains, and he'll walk away free. He's done it for 50 years. He knows how to make people disappear. We can't run, we have to fight, and those tapes are the only way. He looked at his 2 students, their faces etched with fear in the pale moonlight. He was their teacher, their mentor. He had led them into this nightmare. He could not lead them to their deaths. You too, he said, his voice firm. You have to find a way off the island. Find a fishing boat, bribe someone, whatever it takes, get to the mainland, and go straight to the American embassy. Tell them everything. Don't go to the local police. They belong to him. We're not leaving you, Costas said, his voice surprisingly steady. The ordeal had stripped away his youthful uncertainty, leaving behind a core of unexpected steel. It's not a debate, Aris said. I'm the one he wants. My name is Pentagon. This is my fight. I can move through the town alone, create a diversion. You two have a better chance of slipping away. If you're not with me, please, get the story out. For my grandfather, for all of them. He saw the conflict in their eyes, the fear warring with their loyalty. But they knew he was right. 3 of them was a group. 1 was a shadow. Reluctantly, Lena nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Be careful, Aris. He gave a weak, grim smile. The time for caution is long past. He watched them disappear. Into the darkness of the rocky coastline, 2 small figures swallowed by the immense, hostile landscape. Then, he turned and began the slow, agonizing journey back towards the town. Back towards the inn, back towards the heart of the danger. Every step was a fresh agony, every shadow, a potential enemy. He was no longer an archaeologist. He was the sole surviving witness, the keeper of a 57-year-old secret, and the only person who could give the dead of Crypt Gamma the justice they were denied. He was his grandfather's son, and he would not run. The village of Cora was a labyrinth of whitewashed alleys, designed to confuse pirates, and now, it seemed, to hide a wounded archaeologist. Aris moved through the sleeping town like a phantom, his body a symphony of pain. He pressed himself into doorways, the cold stone, a brief respite from the fire in his shoulder, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The moon was his enemy, casting long, telltale shadows that seemed to stretch out and betray him. Every barking dog, every clatter of a loose shutter, sent a fresh jolt of terror through his system. He knew Lycurgus's men would be out. They would be hunting. His inn, a small family-run place called the Anemone, was on the edge of the village, overlooking the port. Getting there was only half the battle. Their workroom was a converted storeroom on the ground floor, its window facing a narrow, little-used alley. That was his way in. He reached the alley, his heart pounding, a frantic tattoo against his ribs. The streetlights cast a sickly yellow glow, making the shadows deep and menacing. He saw them immediately. A black Mercedes was parked 50 yards down the road, its engine off, its presence a silent, predatory threat. Two men sat inside, their silhouettes visible against the dim light. Like Ruris's men, they were waiting. He cursed under his breath. He couldn't get to the workroom without being seen. He was trapped. He slumped against the wall, the rough stucco scraping his back, his head swimming. The blood loss was making him weak, his thoughts disjointed. He was going to fail. He was going to bleed out in this filthy alley, and the tapes. The voices of his grandfather's witnesses would remain silent forever. He thought of his mother. He pictured her face, the quiet, persistent sadness that had always seemed to linger. In her eyes, he was doing this for her. To wipe away the shame she had carried her entire life. To replace the story of an abandoning father with the truth of a heroic one. The thought gave him a fresh surge of adrenaline, a clarity that cut through the fog of pain. He couldn't give up. He looked around the alley, his eyes scanning for another option. There was a rusted drainpipe running up the side of the inn. Right next to the workroom window. It was old, probably unstable. In his condition, climbing it was madness, it was suicide. But staying here was also a death sentence. He had no other choice. He took a deep breath, the air burning his lungs, and grabbed the pipe. It groaned in protest, the metal cold and slick beneath his good hand. He began to climb. It was a clumsy, agonizing ascent. He used his legs to brace himself against the wall, his right arm doing all the work, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, a dead weight of pure agony. With every upward movement, his shoulder screamed, a blinding white-hot pain that threatened to make him pass out. He gritted his teeth, the taste of blood and sweat in his mouth. He focused on the window, just a few feet above him now. It was his only goal. The world narrowed to the feel of the pipe, the rough texture of the wall, and the burning fire in his shoulder. He reached the window ledge, his fingers numb, his muscles screaming. He clung there, panting, his body trembling with exhaustion. The window was a simple wooden frame with a latch. Locked, of course. He fumbled in his pocket for his the small, familiar weight, a small comfort. His fingers were slick with blood and sweat, and he almost dropped it twice. He managed to work the small knife blade into the crack between the window and the frame. He jiggled it, pushed, prayed. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the latch gave way. He almost sobbed with relief. He pushed the window open and half fell, half crawled into the room, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of pain and exhaustion. He lay there for a moment, listening. The men in the car hadn't heard. He was safe. For now, the workroom was organized chaos. Crates were stacked against the walls, tables were covered in pottery shards, and the air smelled of dust and ancient earth. He staggered to his feet, using a table for support, and began his search. He scanned the labels on the crates, his vision blurry, CG01, CG02, Crypt Gamma. He found the crate labeled Personal Effects and tore it open with his good hand, scattering the contents across the floor. Corroded metal tools, fragments of leather, buttons. And there, at the bottom, were 3 small, rectangular metal boxes, caked in dirt and calcite. His heart leaped. He picked one up, his hand trembling. It was heavier than he expected. He used his multi-tool to pry open the rusted lid. Inside, nestled in what was once a felt lining, was a cassette tape. He had found them. The voices of the dead. He stuffed the 3 boxes into the pockets of his jacket, his mind already racing. He had the evidence. Now he had to get it out. He couldn't go back the way he came. He looked around the room. There was a door that led into the main hallway of the inn. It was a risk, but it was better than climbing back down that drainpipe. He took a deep breath, opened the door a crack, and peered out. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a single low-wattage bulb. The innkeeper and his family lived on the top floor. They wouldn't be awake. He slipped out, his bare feet making no sound on the cool tile floor. He moved towards the back of the inn, towards the kitchen, hoping to find a back door that led to a different street. As he passed the small unattended reception desk, he saw it. A telephone, An old rotary dial phone. A sudden, desperate idea bloomed in his mind. He couldn't get the tapes off the island. Not yet, but he could get the story out. He knew a number he had memorized years ago for a different life, a different career path he had almost taken. Before archaeology, he had flirted with journalism, interning for a summer at the foreign desk of the BBC in London. His mentor there was a man named Alistair Finch, a grizzled, cynical, old-school reporter who had a bloodhound's nose for a story and a deep-seated hatred for bullies and tyrants. If anyone would believe him, if anyone would know what to do, it was Alistair. It was a massive risk. Lycoris could have the inn's phone tapped, but it was a risk he had to take. He picked up the heavy receiver, the dial tone a comforting hum. His fingers were clumsy as he dialed the long string of numbers for the international operator, then for the BBC news desk. He prayed Alistair was on the night shift. He prayed he would get through. BBC World Service, a crisp, female voice, answered. Alistair Finch. Eris rasped, his voice low and urgent. It's an emergency. Tell him it's Thorne, the intern, from years ago. He waited, his ear pressed to the receiver, his eyes scanning the street outside the inn's front windows. The black Mercedes was still there. He heard a click on the line, and then a familiar, grumpy voice. Who is this? It's 3 a.m. Alistair, it's Aris Thorne. There was a pause. Thorne. The kid who knew his Hellenistic pottery. Christ, I thought you'd be running a museum by now. What's wrong? You sound like hell. I'm in trouble, Alistair, big trouble. In a torrent of whispered, frantic words, Eris poured out the story. The crypt, his grandfather, the names on the wall, the Lycoris family, the murders, the Nazi gold, the shootout, the tapes. He laid it all out, the whole ugly, 57-year-old secret. Alistair was silent throughout the entire recital. Aris could picture him on the other end, leaning forward in his chair, his cynical mask falling away, the old journalistic fire igniting in his eyes. When Aris finished, the silence stretched for a long moment. Where are you now? Alistair's voice was different. It was sharp, focused. It was the voice of a man who smelled the biggest story of his career, an island Amorganos. I have the tapes, Alistair. I have the proof. Stay put, Alistair said, his voice firm. Don't talk to anyone. Don't trust anyone. I'm on it. I'm going to light a fire under the Foreign Office. I'm going to call in every favor I have. Just stay alive. Kid, we're coming. The line went dead. Aris hung up the phone, a small measure of relief washing over him. He wasn't alone anymore. The story was out. But as he looked out the window at the silent, waiting car, he knew that Alistair's help was a world away. He was still here, wounded, trapped on an island with a killer who was closing in. The sun would be up in a few hours. His time was running out. He had to hide. Not just himself, but the tapes. They were his life insurance. They were his grandfather's legacy. He couldn't keep them on him. If they caught him, they would find them. He looked around the inn's lobby. There were potted plants, dusty bookshelves, a glass case full of cheap souvenirs. Nowhere was safe. His eyes fell on a display of local pottery for sale. It was cheap, tourist-grade stuff, badly made replicas of ancient An idea sparked. A desperate, insane idea. He grabbed one of the smaller pots, one with a narrow neck. He carefully fed the 3 cassette tape boxes into it. The fit tight. Then he went into the kitchen, found a bag of plaster of Paris used for repairing the inn's crumbling walls, and mixed a small amount with water. He poured the wet plaster into the top of the amphora, sealing the tapes inside. He worked quickly, his hands shaking, smearing dust and grime over the fresh plaster to make it look old, to make it blend in. He placed the doctored pot back on the shelf with the others, just another piece of cheap, forgettable tourist tat. He had just stepped back when he heard the sound of a car door opening. Headlights flashed across the front of the inn. A new car had arrived, joining the first one. More men. They were getting impatient. They were going to come in. He had to run. He slipped out the back door of the kitchen, into another narrow alley. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away from the inn, to lead them away from the tapes. He began to run, his body screaming in protest, the fire in his shoulder a supernova of pain. He could hear shouting behind him, the sound of boots on gravel. They had seen him. The hunt was on. He plunged deeper into the labyrinth of the sleeping village, a wounded animal fleeing the pack, the first rays of dawn beginning to knife through the darkness behind him. He had exposed the secret. Now, the conflict was no longer about the past. It was a brutal, desperate fight for the future, and he was the prize. The sun rose, and with it, the island's cruelty became stark and unforgiving. The whitewashed walls were no longer charming. They were blinding, reflecting the heat, and Aris's own desperate, haggard face at every turn. The hunt had escalated from a quiet, shadowy affair to a brutal, island-wide manhunt. Lycurgus had unleashed his dogs. Men in dark suits, their faces hard and emotionless, were everywhere. They stood at the port, their eyes scanning the handful of passengers boarding the morning ferry. They patrolled the narrow streets, their presence a suffocating blanket of menace. They had his picture. The innkeeper, a man whose family had lived on Lycurgus's land for generations, had no doubt supplied it willingly. Aris was trapped in the upper village, a maze of abandoned half-ruined houses that clung to the hillside like barnacles. He had spent the night huddled in the shell of a goat-herder's hut, shivering with fever and pain, listening to the sounds of the hunt below. His shoulder was a swollen, grotesque mess. The wound was infected. He could feel the heat radiating from it, the poison seeping into his bloodstream. He was getting weaker, his thoughts becoming fragmented, delirious. He tore a strip from the bottom of his filthy shirt and tied it around his head, a crude attempt to disguise his appearance. But he knew it was futile. He was a foreigner, wounded and desperate. He stood out like a bloodstain on a white sheet. He needed water. His throat was a desert, his lips cracked and bleeding. He saw a public fountain in a small deserted square 100 yards below him. It was a terrible risk. The square was open, exposed. But the thirst was a physical torment, overriding his fear. He waited, watching, for what felt like an eternity. The square remained empty. He took a chance. He stumbled from his hiding place, trying to walk as normally as possible, his body screaming in protest. He kept his head down, his eyes on the dusty ground. He was halfway across the square when he heard the voice. "You, stop." Aris froze. He didn't turn around. He knew that voice. It was the same cultured, venomous tone that had echoed in the crypt. Elias Lycurgus. He turned slowly. Lycurgus was standing 10 feet away, flanked by 2 of his thugs. He was dressed in immaculate white linen, looking as if he had just come from a pleasant breakfast on his villa's terrace. He was smiling, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. "You have led us on quite a chase, Dr. Thorne," Lycurgus said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "I must confess, I underestimated you. You have your grandfather's resilience. It is an unfortunate family trait." Aris didn't speak. He saved his energy. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. There was none. The alleys leading from the square were blocked by more of Lycurgus's men. He was cornered. "The game is over," Lycurgus continued, taking a step closer. "We searched your room. We searched the entire inn. The tapes are not there. Where are they?" Aris met his gaze, his own eyes burning with fever and hatred. "Go to hell." Lycurgus's smile faltered. He sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment, so defiant. "Very well." He nodded to one of his men. The man stepped forward and, without a word, slammed his fist into Aris's stomach. The air exploded from Aris's lungs. He doubled over, gasping, the world dissolving into a grey shimmering haze. The thug grabbed him by his wounded shoulder, and Aris screamed a raw, animal sound of pure agony. The pain was absolute, a white light that consumed everything. "I am a patient man," Lycurgus said, his voice dangerously soft as Aris hung in the thug's grip. "But my patience has its limits. My associates, however, have no such limits. They can be very persuasive. We can do this here, in the hot sun, Or we can take you somewhere more private. Somewhere you can scream without disturbing the tourists. The choice is yours. The tapes, where are they? Through the blinding fog of pain, Aris thought of the pottery pot. He prayed it was still there, hidden in plain sight. He had to protect it. He had to give Alistair time. He shook his head, a small, defiant gesture. I don't know what you're talking about. Lycoris's face hardened, the mask of civility finally dropping away to reveal the raw, brutal monster beneath. You disappoint me, Dr. Thorne. Truly. He gestured again, and the second thug stepped forward. This one held something in his hand, a pair of pliers. Let's try a different approach, Lycoris said, his voice as cold as the grave his grandfather lay in. Let's talk about your students. Aris's head snapped up. The fear for himself was nothing compared to the cold dread that now flooded his veins. They're gone. They're off the island. Lycoris chuckled, a dry rattling sound. Did you really think it would be so easy? Did you think you could just send them away? This is my island. Nothing happens here that I do not know about. He pulled a phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. He turned it so Aris could see. It was a live video feed. It showed a dark, cramped space, a boat's engine room, by the look of it. And huddled in the corner, their faces pale with terror, were Lena and Costas. They were bound and gagged. A burly fisherman, a man Aris recognized from the port, stood over them, a cruel smirk on his face. They hired a fisherman this morning, Lycoris explained conversationally. A man named Spiros. A good man, very loyal, he was supposed, to take them to Naxos. Instead, he took them for a little cruise. They are currently enjoying the view from the bottom of his boat, 10 miles out to sea. Whether they continue to enjoy that view, or whether they are given a chance to admire the marine life up close, depends entirely on you. The world crumbled around Aris. The betrayal was absolute. He had sent them into a trap. He had led them to their deaths. The weight of his failure was a physical blow, more devastating than any punch. He had tried to be a hero, and he had gotten everyone killed. You bastard, Aris whispered, the words choked with despair. The tapes, Lycoris repeated, his voice like flint. Or, your students die, and then you die, and the story dies. With you, this is your last chance. Where are they? Aris stared at the phone, at the terrified eyes of his students. He saw Lena's silent tears, Costas's desperate, pleading gaze. He thought of his grandfather, dying alone in the dark. He thought of the other names on the wall. He had wanted justice for them. But what was justice worth if it was built on the bodies of his friends? He was broken. Lycoris had won. The inn Aris croaked, his voice a dead, hollow thing. In the lobby, a pottery pot, on the shelf, Lycoris smiled, a triumphant, predatory gleam in his eyes. He barked an order into his phone in Greek. Then he looked back at Aris, who was sagging in the thug's grasp, defeated. Thank you, Dr. Thorne. I knew you would see reason. He nodded to his men. Take him to the villa, put him on ice. When I have the tapes, we will finish this. They dragged him away, his feet scraping on the stones of the square. He didn't fight. He didn't have the strength. He had been so close. He had held the truth in his hands, and he had let it slip away. As they shoved him into the back of the Mercedes, he caught one last glimpse of the village, of the sun-drenched walls and the impossibly blue sky. It looked so beautiful, so peaceful, a perfect facade for the heart of darkness that lay beneath. The injustice was a physical sickness, a poison more potent than the infection in his shoulder. He had not only failed to bring the truth to light, he had become a part of the cover-up, another victim whose silence would pave the way for the guilty to walk free. He closed his eyes, the darkness, a welcome relief. The conflict was over, and he had lost everything. The plot twist arrived not with a bang, but with a click. The quiet, unassuming click of a send button in a London newsroom 4,000 kilometers away. Alistair Finch was not a man who waited for permission. When Aris's call had ended, he hadn't just called the Foreign Office, he had mobilized an army. He was a creature of the digital age, a grand master of information warfare. He knew that governments were slow, and embassies were cautious. But the internet was immediate. He transcribed the key points of Arisa's frantic call: illegal tomb, Nazi collaboration, mass murder, like Arisa's family, a Morgano's British citizen murdered 1968, grandson. Dr. Aris Thorne, currently hunted on island. He packaged it into a tight, explosive email. He didn't send it to the main newswire. That was too slow, too easy to contain. He sent it to a carefully curated list of 150 people. Every major investigative journalist he knew at every rival paper and network, from the New York Times to Der Spiegel. A dozen human rights lawyers who owed him favors, a handful of influential history bloggers, and 3 notoriously aggressive members of parliament who loved a good scandal, especially one that involved government inaction. He attached a single file to the email, a high-resolution scan of Arthur Peneligan's last letter to his publisher from 1968, which Alistair, with a reporter's instinct, had dug out of the archives years ago for a piece on missing persons. The letter that spoke of a story of unimaginable darkness and named the Lycoris family. It was the corroboration, the spark that would turn a wild accusation into a credible threat. He hit send, and the conspiracy, so carefully contained for 57 years on a remote Greek island, was blasted across the globe. The digital bomb had been detonated, while Aris was being dragged, broken, and defeated, to Lycoris's villa. The story was already beginning to catch fire. A junior editor at The Guardian saw the email, recognized Alistair Finch's name, and his eyes widened. He forwarded it to his senior editor with the subject line, "Holy shit." In Berlin, a veteran reporter for Die Zeit, who had spent his career tracking down stolen Nazi assets, felt a familiar thrill. In New York, a producer for a primetime news show cancelled her lunch and started making calls. The story was too cinematic. Too perfect. The handsome young archaeologist, the murdered grandfather, the Nazi gold, the corrupt dynasty on a picturesque Greek island. It was irresistible. The first online headline appeared less than an hour after Alistair hit send. It was on a popular UK political blog. Known for its sensationalism, Archaeologist held hostage by Greek tycoon after uncovering father's Nazi-era murder plot. It was riddled with inaccuracies, but it was enough. The hashtag free Aris Thorne began to trend on Twitter. The British tabloids, smelling blood, began chartering planes and boats. The story had gone viral. Ilias Lycoris was in his study, the retrieved pottery pot on his mahogany desk, a hammer in his hand. He was savoring his victory. He had the tapes. He had the boy. He had his students. He would destroy the evidence, dispose of the bodies, and this whole messy affair would be over. The silence would be restored. He raised the hammer, ready to smash the pot and reclaim his peace. And then his phone began to ring. It was his lawyer in Athens. His voice was frantic. "Elias, turn on the news, any international channel. Now." Lycoris frowned, annoyed by the interruption. He turned on the large television mounted on his wall. He switched to BBC World News, and he froze. The breaking news banner was scrolling across the bottom of the screen. His name, his family's name, the words Nazi collaboration. He saw a picture of a young, smiling Arthur Peneligan, then a recent university photo of Aris, and then a picture of his own villa. His phone rang again, and again, and again. His contacts in the Greek government, his business partners in Germany, his friends in London. Some were panicked, some were furious. All of them were cutting ties. The wall of silence he had built around himself, the wall of power and influence and fear, was crumbling in real time. He looked from the television screen to the pot on his desk. The tapes weren't just evidence anymore. They were a liability of catastrophic proportions. If the world believed he had them, they would tear his life apart to find them. But if he destroyed them, he destroyed the only thing that could possibly, in some twisted way, prove his version of events. He was trapped. The secret he had killed to protect was now his poison pill. The full weight of the conspiracy was no longer just about the past. It had metastasized. It was about the cover-up. It was about the attempted murder of Lena and Costas. It was about the kidnapping. The story wasn't just about what his father had done, it was about what he had done, last night and this morning. The stakes had shifted from a personal vendetta to an international scandal. A new kind of terror, one he hadn't felt since he was a young man standing over Arthur Penelligan's body, seized him. It was the fear of public shame, of total and utter ruin. He had been so focused on controlling his island that he had forgotten about the world outside it. A world with long-range cameras, with satellite phones, with an insatiable appetite for the downfall of powerful men. He heard the sound then, the same sound from the night before, the rhythmic thumping of a helicopter, but this time it wasn't a chartered news chopper. This was the deep, resonant beat of a military aircraft. He ran to the window. 2 Hellenic Coast Guard helicopters were descending, not on the necropolis, but on his own manicured lawn. Armed commandos were already rappelling down. The game wasn't over, it had just entered a whole new, terrifying level. The full power of the state, spurred into action by international outrage and political pressure, was descending upon his fortress. His private kingdom was being invaded. In the basement of the villa, Aris was chained to a pipe. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, the world a blur of pain and fevered dreams. He heard the helicopters, a distant, muffled sound. He thought he was hallucinating, dreaming of a rescue that would never come. Then he heard shouting. From upstairs, doors slamming, the sound of running feet. The door to the basement burst open. It wasn't one of Lycoris's thugs. It was a man in a black tactical uniform, a rifle in his hands, the Greek flag patched on his sleeve. He was followed by more commandos, their weapons sweeping the room. One of them knelt beside Aris, a medic by the Red Cross on his helmet. He shone a light in Aris's eyes, then immediately spoke into his radio. "We have him. He's alive. He's wounded, but he's alive." And in that moment, the hidden clue that changed everything wasn't a tape or a diary. It was Aris himself. His survival was the plot twist. Lycoris had believed he had all the time in the world to clean up his mess. But the speed of the digital world, the viral spread of his story, had outpaced the speed of his violence. Aris' continued existence was the one piece of evidence Lycoris couldn't destroy. The living proof of the kidnapping and assault. As the medic began to cut away the filthy bandage on his shoulder, Aris looked at the commandos fanning out through the basement. He looked at their weapons, their official uniforms, and for the first time in 24 hours, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The tension, which had been a suffocating weight of despair, was now cranked to its absolute maximum. The private war was over. The public one was about to begin. And the main exhibit was no longer buried in a crypt. It was chained to a pipe in a billionaire's basement, bleeding, feverish, and ready to testify. As they helped him to his feet, another commando came running down the stairs. "We have Lycoris," he said. He was in his study. He smashed a pot, but it was empty, just plaster. Aris managed a weak, grim smile. The real pot, the one with the tapes, was still on a shelf in a dusty little inn, hidden in plain sight, an unassuming piece of tourist junk waiting for its moment in the spotlight. The final damning piece of the puzzle was safe. Lycoris had the wrong pot. In his panic, he had destroyed a decoy. The real treasure, the voices of the dead, was still waiting to be found. And now, the whole world would be looking for it. The courtroom in Athens was a pressure cooker, a modern amphitheater where the ghosts of Amorganos had finally come to seek their justice. The trial of Elias Lycoris was more than a legal proceeding. It was an international media event, a national reckoning. The gallery was packed with journalists from every major news outlet, their laptops and cameras aimed like weapons at the man in the dock. Lycoris sat there, diminished, his expensive suit hanging on a frame that had shrunk with fear and humiliation. The aura of untouchable power he had worn his entire life had been stripped away, leaving only a pale, aging man, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. The families of the other names on the crypt wall were there, flown in from around the world, their faces a mixture of grief and grim determination. And in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, sat Alina Thorne, Arisa's mother. The cinematic payoff did not come from a single bombshell moment, but from a slow, deliberate, and utterly devastating dismantling of a man's life and legacy. The prosecution, led by a fiery, relentless lawyer named Danae Stratu, built their case brick by meticulous brick. They had the science, the forensic analysis of the crypt, the carbon dating of the calcite formations over the inscriptions, proving they were decades old. They had the motive, the detailed reports from historians and financial investigators tracing the Lycaris family's fortune back to the stolen assets of the murdered Jewish community during the Nazi occupation. They had the living evidence, the raw emotional testimony of Lena and Kostas, who recounted their terror in the crypt and their kidnapping at sea, their voices shaking but steady. And then, they brought in the star witness. When Aris Thorne walked into the courtroom, a hush fell over the gallery. He had recovered, but the ordeal had left its mark. He was thinner, his face etched with a new, somber maturity. The sling on his arm was gone, but he moved with a stiffness that spoke of a pain that was more than physical. He took the stand, his eyes clear and calm, and looked directly at the jury. He did not look at Elias Lycaris. He told his story. Not with the frantic panic of a hunted man, but with the cool, measured precision of a scholar. He walked the court through the discovery, the inscriptions, the dawning horror. He recounted Lycaris's confession in the tomb, his words echoing in the silent room. He said, "My grandfather was a foolish man," Aris recounted, his voice steady. He said he asked too many questions. He said, "We simply tidied up." Lycaris's defense was built on arrogance and denial. His lawyers painted Aris as a famed, unstable academic who had fabricated the entire story, desecrating a historical site in the process. They claimed the inscriptions were forgeries, that Lycaris's presence at the crypt was simply that of a concerned landowner, and that the shooting was a tragic misunderstanding by an overzealous security guard. They were trying to create doubt, to muddy the waters, to turn the trial into a he said affair. It was then that Stratu played her ace. "The defense claims that my client, Dr. Thorne, is a liar and a forger," she said, her voice ringing with indignation. "They claim that the story he tells is a fantasy. But Arthur Penelgon, a man buried alive 57 years ago, left behind more than just his name on a wall. He left his voice." She signaled to an aide, who brought a vintage cassette player and placed it on the prosecutor's table. The pot from the inn, carefully broken open by forensic experts, had yielded its treasure. The tapes had been painstakingly restored by technicians at the BBC. "We have here a recording," Stratu announced, "made by Arthur Penelgon in the summer of 1968. It is an interview with a man named Ioannis Patrokis, an elderly fisherman at the time, now deceased. Mr. Patrokis is describing what he witnessed on the night of August 12, 1943. She pressed play. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft hiss of the old tape. And then, a voice filled the room. An old man's voice, hesitant and fearful, speaking in heavily accented Greek. "I saw them," the voice crackled. "A ghost from half a century ago. Stavros Lycaris and his men. They brought the families to the cliffs, the Goldsteins, the Levi family. The children were crying. Stavros, he told the Germans he would handle it. He said it was cleaner this way. They took their jewelry, their money, everything, and then they pushed them into the old tombs. They sealed them in." I heard the screaming for hours. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Alina Thorne let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. But Stratu wasn't finished. She picked up another tape. "And now," she said, her eyes locked on Elias Lycaris, whose face had turned the color of ash, the voice of Arthur Penelgon himself. His final journal entry, recorded just hours before he was murdered. She pressed play again. This time, it was a young man's voice, crisp and British, filled with a mixture of horror and righteous fury. "I have it," Arthur's voice said, alive and vibrant after 57 years of silence. The proof: Stavros Lycouris didn't just collaborate. He was the architect. He orchestrated the massacre of his own neighbors to steal their wealth. And his son, Elias, he's part of it, he knows. He threatened me today. He had the eyes of a killer. But the story has to come out. The world has to know what happened here. If anything happens to me, the evidence is in the metal box with my camera. Get it to London, get it to the world. Don't let them bury the truth. The tape ended with a sudden sharp sound, followed by shouting in the background. Then, silence. It was a checkmate. The courtroom erupted. Elias Lycouris lunged to his feet, a primal scream of rage and denial tearing from his throat. Lies, all lies. Doctored tapes. But it was too late. His face, his reaction, was his confession. The cameras flashed, capturing his unmasking for the entire world to see. The jury stared at him, their faces masks of cold, utter revulsion. Justice, after 57 years, had finally arrived. It was public, it was explosive, and it was absolute. The verdict was a formality, guilty on all counts. Murder, kidnapping, conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His words, a damning indictment of a life built on blood and lies. As they led him away in handcuffs, his eyes, for a single moment, met Oresis. They were no longer the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of a ghost, a man already buried under the weight of his own crimes. The public exposure was total. The Lycouris empire crumbled. Their assets were seized, their businesses dismantled. A significant portion of the fortune, the stolen Nazi gold, was allocated to a foundation for Holocaust remembrance and to the descendants of the families murdered on Amorganos. The name Lycouris, once a symbol of power, was now a byword for infamy. The poetic twist of fate was complete. The man who had tried to bury history was now consumed by it. The viral moment wasn't just his conviction. It was the complete and utter obliteration of his name, a public execution of a legacy that had been a lie from the very beginning. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a quiet, somber settling of accounts with the past. The dust of the trial settled, the media frenzy moved on to its next fleeting obsession. And what was left was the profound, echoing silence of lives that had been irrevocably changed. For Aris, the healing was slow, a journey not of forgetting, but of understanding. The physical wounds faded to scars, but the emotional ones ran deeper. The world no longer looked the same to him. He had seen the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of beauty, the violence that history tried so hard to conceal. He returned to archaeology, but with a different purpose. He no longer saw it as an academic pursuit, but as a sacred duty to the forgotten, a way to give voice to the silenced. 6 months after the trial, he returned to Amor. The island was different, quieter, as if holding its breath after a long fever. The tourists were fewer, and the Lycouris villa on the cliff stood empty, its windows dark and vacant like the eyes of a skull. The Greek government had declared the entire southern slope a protected archaeological park and memorial. Crypt Gamma had been unsealed. He stood at the entrance to the tomb, the place where his life had been shattered and remade. It was no longer a place of terror. It had been cleaned, lit, and transformed into a place of remembrance. The names on the wall had been preserved behind a sheet of protective glass, each one a testament to a life cut short. Below them, a simple bronze plaque had been installed. It listed all the names of the victims, the ones from 1943 and the ones from the Junta years. Their stories finally intertwined, their common fate acknowledged. His mother, Alina, was with him. It was her first time back on the island since she was a child. She had resisted, the place holding too many formless terrors for her. But after the trial, after hearing her father's voice on the tapes, something within her had shifted. The vague anxiety that had haunted her life had been replaced by a specific, knowable grief. She had lost a father not to abandonment, but to heroism. It was a painful truth, but it was a truth she could hold, a truth that had finally, after a lifetime, set her free. She walked into the crypt, Her steps, hesitant, but steady. She stood before the wall, her eyes tracing the letters of her father's name. Eris watched as she reached out a trembling hand and pressed her palm against the cool glass, right over the name Arta Penagon. She closed her eyes, and, for the first time since Eris could remember, the deep, persistent sadness in her face seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet, profound peace. She was no longer the daughter of a man who had left. She was the daughter of a man who had stayed and fought. They stood there for a long time. Mother and son, two halves of a story made whole. They didn't speak. There were no words for the immensity of the moment. It was a silent communion with the ghost, who was no longer a ghost, but a presence, a memory, a legacy of courage. Later, they walked to the cliffs overlooking the sea, the place where Arthur had spent his last free moments. The sun was setting, the sky painted in the same violent, beautiful streaks of orange and purple that Eris had seen on the night he first found the crypt. They had brought a small, simple stone with them. It was a marker, not a grave, for Arthur's body, like the others, would remain in the crypt. A permanent guardian of the truth he had died to protect. Alina knelt and placed the stone at the edge of the cliff. Eris had carved the inscription himself. It didn't speak of murder or betrayal. It spoke of the man he had been, Arthur Penelegon, 1945 sampai 1968 rider. Husband, he loved forgotten places. The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything that had been lost and found. The cost of the truth had been immense, paid in blood and terror and 57 years of lies. But here, at the edge of the world, in the quiet of the coming dusk, there was a sense of balance restored. It was a bittersweet healing, a scar on the heart of the island that would never fade, but a scar that now told a story not of darkness, but of a light that refused to be extinguished. The emotional echo of Arthur Penelegon's final defiant act would linger here forever, a haunting reminder that some voices, no matter how long they are buried, can never truly be silenced.